All right, everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel, The Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Hugo Mercier. He is a research scientist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, Institut Jean Nicod, that is the National Center for Scientific Research in France, where he works with the Evolution and Social Cognition team. Most of his work so far has focused on the function and workings of reasoning. Together with Dan Sperber, he wrote a book that develops and extends the argumentative theory of reasoning called The Enigma of Reason. So, Dr. Mercier, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so the first question I would like to ask you, first I thought about asking you what is reason, but I guess that we should start off by talking a little bit about how reason has evolved, because I mean, since it is a component of our cognitive system, and nowadays, at least from an evolutionary perspective, we deal with the several cognitive components or modules as the result of evolutionary processes. So how has it evolved, and what is the function that it serves?
So there is no consensus on that question, but the theory that Dan Sperber and I have been developing is that human reason serves mostly social purposes. And in particular, we think that that reason evolved to serve two main functions. One is to exchange justification, so to justify your actions or your thoughts, and to evaluate other people's justifications. And the other is to argue. So not to argue in the sense of having a shouting match, but to argue in the sense of exchanging arguments, so that I can try to convince you of something, and you can evaluate my arguments and decide if they're good enough to be persuaded.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So from that point of view, reason really departs from the traditional notion that we have of it as being something that we have that would allow by itself for us to get to objective truth, let's say.
Well, I think the main... So there is what we've termed like an intellectualist tradition that sees reason indeed as a tool for reaching better decisions or reaching better beliefs, standard beliefs. But what that tradition emphasizes is that reason is supposed to achieve these ends pretty much on our own. So each individual reasoner, by kind of thinking things through carefully, and is supposed to reach these ends, so to make better decisions and to arrive at standard beliefs. And so we're not saying that reason doesn't help the overall goal of arriving at better decisions and standard beliefs, but what we're saying is that it usually does this in a social context when you're exchanging arguments and reasons with others rather than on your own.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we get a bit more specific about it, let me just ask you to explain, because I think this is important for this conversation, could you explain what is a cognitive module? And perhaps since you and Dan Sperber refer to that example in your book, perhaps talk a little bit about the example of the desert ant navigational system.
So there are several ways of looking at how the mind works, as like in a very kind of broad strokes. In some models, the mind would be, to exaggerate a bit, like a kind of one big mechanism, or like a lot of the brain would be, one big mechanism that wouldn't have easily identifiable subparts. So it would be like a big neural net, and its sheer size would allow it to solve the very complex problems that humans are able to solve. An alternative view, and these are really kind of two ends of a continuum, is that the human mind is made up of individual modules. So they would be partially independent mechanisms And each of them would, as the name suggests, work mostly in isolation from other mechanisms. So the term module is kind of fraught in psychology because since it's been either kind of introduced or popularized by Jerry Fodder in the early 80s, it came when it was introduced, rather, it came with a rather strict set of criteria for what would count as a module. So it had to be essentially innate, it had to have a very kind of specific neurological location, it had to be mandatory so that as soon as the right stimulus would arrive, the module would take effect. And as it so happens, essentially none of that works. And so the conditions for what counts as a module have been very much relaxed. And the main component that remains now is informational encapsulation, which means that you can think of a module as an information processing mechanism. So you have some kind of input that gets in, like as if you're typing something on your computer, and then it's going to process the information and deliver some kind of output that is better in some way, that is kind of informationally enriched. You're kind of adding something to it, and like a word processor could tell you if there was a mistake or spelling mistake in what you've written, and the idea of informational encapsulation is that once the stimulus arrives, reaches the module, and the module is activated to a given extent because it seems to be relevant at that point, then it's going to take its course independently of whatever else is happening in the system. So it's not going to be influenced by like higher level processes. It's not going to be influenced by other mechanisms that might be going on in parallel. So the reason we think that people who defend a kind of a modularist perspective, one of the reasons they think it's correct is that it's hard to imagine how one big mechanism would work. And essentially everything we seem to observe in nature is very highly modular, everything that works. So if you look at, a cell is very modular. If you look at, obviously bodies with their organs and their layers and everything are very modular. Anything that is any complex artifact is also modular. So, any piece of code can be extremely highly modular if you want to be able to understand it and to change it when something doesn't work. And another advantage of modularity is that it allows bringing in one of the things that modules do is that they encapsulate some information from the outside. So what happens is that the way the information is processed, by being kind of always the same for a given stimulus, it allows you to get some information that was it allows you to save time in a way. It's a heuristic that stops you having to recalculate everything every time. So you're just relying on information that's already there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so according to this approach that you have to reasoning, would you say that it still makes sense what people do most of the time when they, for example, differentiate reasoning from rationalizing? That is, many times people simply make a decision or say something, and then only after the fact do they try to come up with reasons to justify what they've just done. So, but does it make sense to differentiate reasoning from this process?
So not from our point of view. So we're kind of cognitive psychologists, and we're taking very much like not a normative stance but a descriptive one. Then our point would be that it is the same cognitive mechanisms that create rationalizations than those that create kind of what you could see as higher order forms of reason, like mathematical arguments or something. So that doesn't mean that there are differences in quality in terms of how good of a reason something is going to be. So you can have really wild rationalizations that are going to be extremely unconvincing. You can have rationalizations that have nothing to do whatsoever with the actual causes of your actions, for instance, where the others will match the actual causes relatively closely. So there are differences of quality but in terms of the processes, the process is going to be essentially the same. The cognitive mechanism that allows you to give rationalizations and any other types of reasons is going to be the same.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another point that I think it is important to consider, and you also refer to this in your book, is the fact that people don't really have access to the cognitive processes that go around in their minds. That is, most of our cognition operates at a subconscious level, correct?
Yes. So we have some cognitive mechanisms of which we're not aware at all. So let's say when you're seeing something, you're not aware of all the small steps that get you from this kind of 2D stream of photons that's hitting your retina to this rich representation you have access to consciously. So all of the intermediate layers are completely unavailable to consciousness. And then for everything that does hit consciousness, you're not aware of the antecedents. So if you see someone for the first time and somehow you don't, that person doesn't feel right, you don't trust them, oftentimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly why that's the case. And then even if you're somehow able to say, kind of to have some idea of why you don't trust them, it's kind of a reconstruction after the fact rather than, it's not as if you're noticing something and then, oh yeah, because of this, I'm going to not trust them. You have the intuition, and then you can, to some extent, try to retrace your steps. And so, yeah, essentially, everything has to go on neurally and consciously. And the thing that we're pointing out is that that is also true for reason to a large extent. So in some ways, when we reason, we're aware of more things than when we engage in many other cognitive operations, because at least you're aware of some kind of premise and some conclusion. So if you tell me, you shouldn't drive tonight, you had too much to drink, I can process the premise, you had too much to drink, and the conclusion, I shouldn't drive tonight, and try to think whether the link is sound or not. But there's still a whole unconscious layer in that the intuition I will have, and that is delivered by our reasoning mechanisms, as to whether the premise is a good reason to accept the conclusion. I don't know why I have this intuition. So as in any other intuition, I can tell you, well, yeah, that's a good reason to be driving, but I can't tell you why. So I can, as in the case of you seeing someone and thinking you don't trust them, you can try to retrace your steps. So if you ask me, but why don't you want to drive? I say, well, because I've had too much to drink. But why? Well, because I might get into an accident. And why? So we can try to retrace our steps to some extent, and usually no one does it more than a few steps, except if you're like a professional philosopher. But we rarely do it, and this reconstruction is not what happens when you have the initial intuition regarding the quality of the reason, and it's not necessary for that intuition to occur.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So would you say that from a modularist point of view of the mind in this case, our cognition is composed of several modules, and each of them is responsible of dealing with certain types of information, and they process this information, and we obtain a result from that, and all of that occurs mostly subconsciously, and sometimes they communicate with each other, the several modules. But I mean, the results we get in cognitive terms from these operate subconsciously, but then something pops up consciously in the form of intuitions, what we would call intuitions, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So some mechanisms have, as we were saying earlier, some mechanisms are purely unconscious. So both the input and the output is unconscious. And other mechanisms have deliver kind of conscious outputs, or outputs that are accessible to consciousness. And that's when you have an intuition. So if someone tells you something, you have an intuition regarding what they mean. And that intuition comes with some kind of metacognitive feeling of confidence, like you're more or less sure that your intuition is correct. And yes, and as we're discussing, the same is true for reason. So when someone gives you an argument, you have an intuition as to whether that's a good argument or not, and you can be more or less sure of your intuition.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you, together with Dan Sperber and others, arrived at the argumentative theory of reasoning. So, was it one of the first steps, the fact that in many psychological experiments, people give a problem, researchers give a problem to people for them to solve, and if reason would have to have worked in a way to get as straight as possible to objective truth, then people would get most of the time their answers right, but that doesn't really happen. And in fact, most of the time, people are not really able to correctly infer the right answer. Right.
So I don't know. I don't know, partly because Dan had come up with the gist of the idea before I met him, essentially, and so the core that at the time it was really kind of argumentation that would be the main function of human reason is something that you'd have to ask him. But certainly he was aware of the literature you're mentioning, and so it's plausible that it played a role in shaping his thinking, and certainly it does play a big role in our argument. So there's something sort of weird in a way about the fact that psychologists of reasoning and of kind of judgment and decision making have been so good at creating problems that fool people. That even though the correct solution should be extremely straightforward, it's completely logically or mathematically trivial. People still give the wrong answer. Most people still give the wrong answer, even if they have time, if they're incentivized, if they're smart, if they're educated, etc., etc. And what's kind of interesting from our point of view is that that didn't stop them from still thinking that reason really should, has this kind of individual function of helping the lone reasoner arrive at better beliefs and correcting our intuitions. So the very thing that again and again they showed reason didn't do in the experiments, they still thought that it was kind of its function. It was just maybe doing it extremely poorly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, and so reason also operates in allowing for us to manage our reputation. So it also has a kind of a social function, right?
Yes, no, it does have social functions, anyways, and one of them indeed is to help us justify our beliefs and our actions. It's something we kind of very much like argumentation. Is something we kind of take for granted. But that without which we would have really vastly poorer social lives. So the rationale here is that clearly cooperation is extremely important for humans, and cooperation is likely sustained by some kind of partner choice mechanism. So people pick the right partners, people who are competent and fair. And people who don't behave that way are not going to be selected as partners, and that's not going to be good for them. And so the whole thing relies on people being able to form accurate assessments of each other. So if you can't tell who is fair or who is unfair or who is competent and who is stupid, you can't have partner selection going, and you shouldn't be able to get good cooperation going as well. I mean, either. And the issue is that it's tremendously difficult to accurately assess someone else's competence or the fairness of their actions. So you can rely on a lot of heuristics, but even if you see an action that appears to be unfair, so you see two people working on something together, and one of them takes maybe most of the, let's say that they bake a cake, and most of them takes most of the cake, it might appear to be unfair, but maybe that person had actually brought all the ingredients. So, if you don't have, or someone, you can see someone, do something that appears to be stupid, like they're using a weird, software on their computer, but then they can explain to you that the other software has been blocked for some reason. So if people were unable to explain themselves, to tell to their audiences and to people who might judge them why they do the things they do, it would be very difficult to have an accurate assessment of other people's fairness or morality more generally and competence. And the reason that the justification, so that's why it's so useful to give justifications, and also why it's so useful to listen to them, because they're not purely cheap talk. So if you give me a justification, I can assess whether the premises are true. So, is it true that you're the one who brought all the ingredients? Is it true that the other software on your computer is stopping you from using the most kind of sensible software? And then I can assess the quality. So if the premises are true, I can assess how good of a reason, how good of a justification they give you for behaving in such and such way. And this way, everybody is better off. So people who are being judged are better off because they can avoid being judged negatively, either as being bad people or as being stupid. And then observers get to judge people more accurately, so they can get a better idea of who they should be friends, kind of partners with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've already referred briefly to this, but reason in terms of arriving at sound arguments and objective truth and things like that works better when it is done in groups. So could you explain that part?
Yes. So according to us, one of the functions of reason is to exchange arguments. So when two people disagree, one solution is to rely on trust. So you can try to figure out who is the most competent, and if whether everybody has everybody else's best interests at heart, and try to trust them. But clearly, in many cases, that's not going to be sufficient because you don't really know what people's interests are, and people might try to manipulate you, and it's hard to tell who is the most competent. And sometimes people who are not necessarily your friends might still have valuable information. And so it would be really useful to have a way of discriminating between kind of harmful and beneficial information in a way that is much finer grained than simply relying on trust. And we think that's what argumentation gives you. So even if I don't trust you in particular, if you give me a good argument, I might change my mind. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see in groups. So what happens when people exchange arguments in groups is that whoever has the best argument is going to win. So that works. So you need some conditions for this to work. You need for people to have some kind of common incentive. So if you're playing poker, you're not going to be able to convince anybody of doing anything because it's a zero-sum game, and that's it. And ideally, you want to have some disagreement, because if we all agree on something, it's likely that nothing good is going to come of the discussion, because we're just going to all kind of give arguments for that thing we all agree on, and we'll end up even more persuaded than we were right at the beginning, whether we were right or not. By contrast, when these conditions are met, so when people have some kind of common incentive and they disagree on one point, then they will provide arguments for their point of view, and the bad arguments are going to be shut down. People are going to be forced to create better arguments, and at the end of the day, or hopefully faster than this, as I was saying, people who have the best arguments should be able to carry the day and to win the discussion. And indeed, that's what we see in a great variety of experiments. So the pattern is extremely clear when it comes to logical or mathematical problems. So if you give some kind of problem for which there is a deductive answer, like the kind of problems that we were referring to earlier, in which most individual participants fail, if you give exactly these problems to small groups of participants, as long as one of them has figured it out, she will be able to convince the whole group that is the right answer, even if the other group members all agree on the same wrong answer and they're really, really sure that the wrong answer is correct. Whoever is right will be able to convince them. And you find similar patterns when people discuss a wide variety of things. So people make better forecasts about the economy or about politics when they discuss their forecasts in groups. Doctors make better medical diagnoses. Jurists make better judicial decisions. Jury render better verdicts. Students, understand problems better and find better solutions to the problems they have in school. And so across a wide range of tasks, argumentation seems to work. So when people, then again, if people have some kind of good faith and some kind of disagreement, exchange arguments with each other, usually it works out quite well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that is good to know. Mm-hmm. Okay, so from this perspective, from this cognitive perspective, of course, Would you say that what people usually refer to as dual process theory, that is, that we have system one and system two in our mind, in our brains, and that system one is sort of fast and frugal and to arrive very quickly at very easy solutions to certain problems, and system two is more deliberative, let's say? Does this division still make sense?
Well, not so much according to us, no, in that at least the division we're introducing between reason and other intuitions is pretty much orthogonal to the standard dual process distinction, in that in most cases reason will behave the way intuitions are supposed to behave. So when you're exchanging arguments with someone, or when you're reading a book to some extent, reason will be fast. So as soon as someone gives you an argument, immediately you understand it. To some extent, you can't really help yourself. So even if you're on the bus and you're overhearing some people talking next to you, if they exchange arguments that you find really dumb, you can't help yourself but notice. So it's fast. It's essentially effortless. As we were saying earlier, there is this whole unconscious dimension to it, so that we're not really aware of why we think that a given reason is good or bad. And so in many ways, reason behaves essentially exactly like an intuition in the vast majority of the cases that we use it in everyday life. By contrast, it's very easy to think of mechanisms that are, very good examples of what people usually refer to as intuitions, that can be used in a very kind of system two fashion. So if you're playing Where is Waldo, and you're using some kind of face recognition or kind of person recognition mechanism, which is like kind of poster boy for something that is purely intuitive. You're doing it in a way that is serial, that is slow, that is effortful, that is consciously controlled, etc., etc. So it seems as if the distinction doesn't really capture, at least the distinction between system one and system two doesn't fit very well in the distinction between intuitions and reason as we define it, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so referring to reason, of course, people sometimes call certain behaviors rational or not. So, but from an evolutionary perspective, would it make sense to call the behaviors that maximize our fitness, that is, that allow for our survival and reproduction, to treat them as rational or not?
Well, I don't know. It's a semantic problem. So the issue with doing this, that then it would just being rational just would be synonymous with being adaptive. So you would lose any extra meaning. So I see how people would try to resist that move. But then, as we were saying earlier, I'm not really so interested in the normative side, so in kind of judging whether people are, rational or not. So from a descriptive point of view, it's not clear what that brings me. Like, I'm not sure what rational means. And so given that we have this kind of objective-ish measure of fitness, as you were saying, but if we can't really use this, then I'm not exactly sure. So usually the way people look at it is if you have a good equation between means and ends. So if you want to achieve some goal and you use means that are completely, that are not going to do that at all, you're irrational. Which is, fair enough, but then clearly that's again kind of orthogonal to the use of reason to a large extent, given that the vast majority of the cognitive mechanisms at play would be intuitions, and like most of the goals we have, we just achieve them purely through kind of intuitive means, and so yeah, it's not clear that we'd have anything special to do to say about rationality. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps just one last question, and since we already covered here the aspect about reason working better in groups, would you say that that is one of the reasons why the scientific enterprise works so well? Because it is a collective endeavor, and also because adding to that, it has a lot of checks and balances.
Yes, so clearly discussing with one another is not enough to create science, because people have been doing that since at least the dawn of philosophy, and the results have been somewhat mixed, let's say, until the scientific revolution, and so I think that's necessary. So in mathematics, some people have been successful reasoning pretty much on their own. I mean, to a large extent, you have kind of the odd recluse who develops, kind of groundbreaking theorems. So that's not the rule. I mean, most mathematicians still are heavily involved in their community, but there are examples of breakthroughs done in mathematics. And I think in that case, the reason is that you can anticipate all the kind of counter arguments that people might raise to your arguments, because all the axioms are there. Everybody kind of agrees on the axioms, and all the relevant stuff to think about is a given to some extent. By contrast, in science, when that is not true, so you have pieces of data, you have perspectives that are distinct. Clearly, you do need that collaborative dimension. You need discussion. And as you were saying, this is really built into science, in the peer review process, in lab meetings, in conferences, in everything, in the fact that scientists keep arguing with each other all the time. And yes, I mean, it would be hard to deny that that's an important part of science. And ironically, even sort of Daniel Kahneman, who we use to some extent as representative of that kind of system 1, system 2 view, even though he himself is very kind of cautious about how it should be used. He does recognize that his best insights, some of his best insights, came from discussing with Amos Tversky, his lifelong collaborator. And so I think most scientists realize that to some extent. Even it does have its negative aspects. Clearly, getting annoying reviews or not being able to change our colleagues' minds can be frustrating. But on the whole, most scientists enjoy that process of argumentation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So just before we go, Dr. Mercier, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can find your work online? What are some of the best resources to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you go on my website, you'll find pretty much, there'll be links to I think, all of my papers. The book is available in the usual places, whether you want to pay for it or not. and the videos, I can past interviews and whatnot, will also be found at my website. So I think it's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So I will be leaving all of that in the description box of this video for the audience to go check it out if they like. And so, Dr. Mercier, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.